Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm Richard Reinsch. Today we're talking with Stephen Hayward about travails in American higher education made possible through cancel culture, and Stephen Hayward's particular experiences at the University of California, Berkeley, with this unsettling development. Stephen Hayward, we're glad to welcome you back to Liberty Law Talk. When you were last on, we discussed your book, Patriotism is Not Enough, Harry Jaffa, Walter Burns, and the arguments that redefined American conservatism. You're also the author of a multi-volume history, The Age of Reagan, and numerous other essays and reviews and studies. You're currently resident scholar at the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley. And of course, many will know you from your almost daily blogging at powerlineblog.com. So we're glad to have you.
Well, thank you, Richard. It's great to be back.
So thinking, and I want to talk about your particular experiences at UC Berkeley with rather unhinged attempts to remove you from campus there by students and less than heroic deans responding to those students. But in general, I'd be interested to get your opinion on this. I think what we're in now in regard to American higher education is sort of the mop-up phase of the Marxist Gramsci's famous call for a long march through the institutions by the left. I think they've marched through them. They've captured all of them, basically. And now they're in a position of such dominance that there's really very little pretense that they need to talk to anyone other than themselves or deal fairly and equitably with anyone other than themselves with regard to education. And other cultural, journalistic enterprises in America, and I think in particular of this, even for the New York Times, shocking development of James Bennett having to resign from the editorial page and Bari Weiss resigning in this fantastic resignation letter about intolerance there. And it just seems, that's sort of where we are, this unraveling of higher education, further erosion of basic norms of freedom, tolerance, expression by scholars and students being unraveled, pulled back, that this is sort of the inevitable outcome of Gramsci's call.
Yeah, I think that's right. For a long time, I thought, like a lot of people did, that, maybe I was too accepting of it, that, the worst of the radicalism on campuses was confined to, women's studies and English departments and language departments, and oddly enough, geography as a discipline went way left quite a long time ago. But that the other disciplines, the main social sciences, political science, sociology, history, although liberal for the most part, and they have been for decades, they hadn't completely succumbed to craziness. Well, that's mostly wrong. Some of the older disciplines are still sort of okay in a relative sense, but you're seeing that the administrations have thirdly thrown in with what you might say the new woke culture that we live in, and it's still beyond the college campus, as we saw with what happened with James Damore at Google out in Silicon Valley. And you may remember, and listeners may remember, when Sam Abrams at Sarah Lawrence, I think is where he is, published that article in the New York Times 2 years ago saying the problem now in the universities is the administration have gone in on this. And of course, he had ferocious blowback over that. But one of the controversies at Berkeley right now and at several other places is essentially the demand that all faculty sign a diversity loyalty oath, and that diversity will now be used as a criteria for hiring. Well, this is simply back to the McCarthy era, right? And there is some blowback against this, even at Berkeley and other UC campuses, but it's all been kind of put on the back burner because we've shut down for the virus.
It seems to me, I graduated from my undergraduate institution in 2001 and from law school in 2004. And I remember in both institutions, one of which was a very progressive institution, we got a lot of mileage out of just pointing out, the lack of representation of conservative, classical liberal voices on the campus. And there seemed to be we seemed to find our voice that way. And there was sort of an implied tolerance and willingness to hear us out, an acknowledgement that, we basically own most of the campus, so we need to do this. And it seems to me that doesn't even really exist anymore. And what really does exist is sort of the use of the university itself as as Glenn Lowry pointed out recently with Brown University's statement, its anti-racism statement, that the university itself becomes a social justice vehicle or becomes essentially an ideological enterprise. And of course, it's been going on now for many years at UCLA, where the professors have to write a statement, I think it's every year, of how they're furthering diversity with their teaching.
Yeah.
And you think of the McCarthy era, but this is something of a religious oath or test that is being required.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I don't know, I see no sign of anybody in administrations at universities recognizing that this is a problem for them. I will say this about Berkeley. It's sort of odd that I got there in the first place. And long backstory to that, which we can go into a little bit if you want.
Yeah.
But a lot of people I've talked to in the political science department, where I've spent some time and taught some classes, and also some people in administration say, we know we have a problem of not enough conservatives on the faculty. And I have to give credit to the Berkeley administration. They have tried to be accommodating to the college Republicans, who are not always as prudent as they might be. They invited Milo, right?
Yeah, I remember that.
The Milo riot. But, however, they don't know what to do about it. They simply rubber stamp any of the most radical ideas that come along. And yeah, this does go back. This goes back at least 50 years to the 60s, when you had the SDS and other the student radicals at the time saying universities should become a node of political activism. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not a place for learning anymore. And yeah, I think you're right. You mentioned graduating 20 years ago now.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're a young guy. I had a friend of mine who had a daughter. Actually, it's my writing partner at Powerline, John Hinderacher. He has two daughters, 10 years apart. They both went to St. Olaf. One graduated 10 years ago, and one graduated just this last year. And the two daughters got together and compared notes. And the second daughter just graduated the first daughter reflecting on her experience, a little bit like yours. Just in the last 10 years, things have gotten so much worse at that same little bucolic campus there in Minnesota.
Yeah, St. Olaf. You mentioned the administrators, and I think that's something people don't understand. You and I understand that this incredible explosion of these people with these jobs on campus has also happened roughly in that same time span, the last 10 to 20 years, outpacing faculty hiring. And part of, a public choice analysis would be they've got to find something to do, something to make themselves worthwhile. But there's also an ideological component here too. And so these equity, diversity, inclusion administrators have really found their measure in appealing to students for greater fairness or greater representational fairness on the basis of gender or race or various status. And that becomes a way in which the campus is constantly in upheaval, but also sort of this totalitarian mentality where you really do get into forcing people to think in certain ways, speak in certain ways in the name of fairness and equity. And I think that's sort of also what's been happening, or it has been happening on campus. Have you seen that? You also taught at the University of Colorado Boulder, itself no shrinking progressive violet.
Right. Yes. Well, thinking about administrators, every institution now has a dean of diversity and inclusion, and usually a large staff.
Yeah.
It's amazing how large the staff can be at the larger universities like Berkeley or Michigan.
6-figure positions, right?
Yes, exactly. And again, one of the more significant moments in this whole story was the Oberlin College libel suit brought by the bakery. That was judged by a jury, a year ago, whenever it was, with a $25 million judgment. And what they found was the dean of diversity and inclusion had been participating with the students and organizing protests against the bakery. Well, I looked up the dean. I forget her name now, but where'd she come from? Well, she came from women's studies. And you look at her publications, and it's all the deeply left-wing, politicized, radical, woke stuff, right? And you're now going to make that person an administrator. And I think you'll find that kind of profile in a lot of these administrative positions at colleges around the country. Not as true at Berkeley. I don't think Berkeley, for instance, has a biased incident response team like Michigan had or may still have. The person who's, I'm not sure if he's a dean or provost, but the person who does diversity and inclusion at Berkeley right now is from the sciences. I think he's a biologist. And I've met him, and I'm sure he's a liberal, but he doesn't seem to be quite as far gone into the fever swamps as you find in so many places.
What's a bias response team?
Well, bias incident response team is where students or faculty, but usually, students can report, incidents of racism or sexism or transphobia, and whether it's something you said or written or said in class even, and they'll come and investigate this. And of course, we know how these investigations go. It's leading to increasing amounts of self-censorship by students and faculty.
Yeah, it was a sign. Also, things were going wrong. Trump wins in 2016, and various universities sort of providing safe spaces on campus for the students to talk about this. And like one of the activities was like to color. Or to express your feelings with color. That was hilarious. So, in general, it seems to me something in the background here, though, is really, it's a Supreme Court opinion. Bakke versus Regents of University of California system, 1978, where there's this mention was it Justice Powell that diversity could be a rationale.
Right.
On the basis that they bring in, their perspective, that becomes in itself a good. But of course, that doesn't really gel with affirmative action, which was about remediation. Diversity becomes an ever-springing justification for this sort of thinking that you were going to tie an ideology to a gender or to a race. And it seems to me this has just whatever Powell intended. And it's not just higher education. It's now corporations. It's now journalism. This has gone beyond this, and it's become, I guess, in a way, just fundamentally illiberal in its consequences.
Yeah, so I mean, it's probably worth reminding listeners a little bit about both affirmative action, how it began, and then the Bakke case.
Yeah.
So, if you go back to the original executive orders from first John F. Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson, and then the initial programs that were adopted in the private sector and universities, the idea was outreach. Let's find minorities who, for whatever reason, bad schools or whatever, have the ability and who should be recruited into the employment pool and then hired on merit equally with anybody else. Well, that didn't last very long. It became de facto quotas pretty fast. And in the Bakke case in the 70s, you had the University of California Medical School at Davis reserved, I think, 21 spots of 100 for the medical school for minorities. And, just no matter what your MCAT scores were, grades and so forth. And Alan Bakke sued because he had very high scores, but had been turned down twice. Meanwhile, all 21 of the students admitted on the quota had test scores and grades, not even a little bit below his, but way below his. So the court said, no, you can't do that. You can't have a numerical quota. But the straddle was, and the whole opinion of the court is a mess because you had all these different concurrences and dissents. And the Justice Powell, you said, was a swing vote saying Bakke wins, you can't have a quota, but diversity can be a factor. Now, I've come to the heretical view just recently that maybe that case was wrongly decided. Maybe we would have been better off. I think it's unprincipled according to a rightful understanding of equality and individual rights. But maybe politically, socially, we'd have been better off if the court said, fine, you can have quotas. Go ahead. Make my day. I think it could have been open what was going on.
Yes.
I think it would have been like busing was in the 60s and 70s. Hugely unpopular, including even with minorities. And I think it would have all collapsed of its own weight. Instead, everybody said, diversity. There's a perfect thing to dodge behind. And now it's become this huge ideology. And it does remind me a little bit, and I know you follow this closely, it reminds me a little bit of the unintended consequences or perverse results of the Chevron case. We talk a lot about the Chevron doctrine. That was a case the Reagan administration won in court.
Yeah.
It's become this nightmare for the bureaucracy, and now it's the thing we most want to get rid of. Well, I think the Bakke case is similar.
Well, it seems to me also a part of this diversity unfolding or unintended consequences, perhaps, the University of California system recently voting to eliminate use of the SAT and ACT in admissions requirements, I think, after this year. And of course, more institutions will follow suit. I mean, you've got the University of California, Los Angeles, UC Berkeley. These are high-performing institutions that will not use this, basic meritocratic criteria. And I think it gives the administrators free rein to shape this campus in the way they want.
Yes, and by the way, I should be very specific about this. The faculty at Berkeley, and I think maybe UCLA, but I know at Berkeley, faculty senate actually voted against the idea.
That's right. I read that.
Right, and I think that's quite significant. So your liberal faculty said, no, wait a minute, we want to keep the SAT. Why is that? Well, it's I can tell you, Berkeley students, for the most part, are really good. It's a hard school to get into. And I think the faculty respects this. They want the smart students, and they understand. But what's really going on here is, and I picked this up, 4 years ago when I first showed up there, that the idea of meritocracy is under attack from the left. And it has to be because in California, the real reason is Asians. The Asians, with this large Asian population, they get super high test scores. And so the first thing that the universities, the diversicrats want to do is they want to get rid of our Prop 209 that bans affirmative action admissions for our public universities. And then they want to be able to shape the demographics of the student body explicitly according to race. And you have to overthrow the idea of meritocracy to do that. And so the SAT is just step one. And I think grades don't mean much anymore, right, because of grade inflation.
Yes.
So at that point, we are going to get back to essentially having quotas, and no one will admit that that's what they're doing.
No, it's absolutely amazing. And it's absolutely amazing that it happens as America increasingly becomes this multiracial society.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing to me. So let's talk about, you go to Berkeley as a visiting professor. You're a conservative. You teach, if I remember, and you talk about this, by the way, in a really nice, entertaining, well-written essay in the current edition of Commentary. And your piece there is How I Ran Afoul of Campus Cancel Culture. But you go to Berkeley to teach, a couple of classes in the undergrad department, and you have a good experience for the first couple of years, so much so that you wonder if you're not doing it right.
Yeah, right. I mean, I kept thinking, why they're not protests, there had been the student newspaper wrote a nasty article about me when I arrived, but that's par for the course. And nobody paid any attention to it, in the administration or in any of the departments.
Well, you said you wrote they wrote a mean piece about you in the student newspaper, but it actually helped your student enrollment.
Well, this is the funny thing is suddenly I was teaching a large lecture class on the Constitution, actually, in political science that no one had been teaching for a while. And I had a long waiting list to get in, even with a room that held 150 people. And I had a couple of students. One kid, actually, I really liked this kid. He was very progressive, a big Bernie Sanders supporter. And he spotted me one day walking across Wow Plaza. I hadn't met him yet. It's before class. But he walks up to me. They looked me up, I guess. Says, "You're Professor Hayward." I said, "Yes, I am." He says, "I'm taking your class. I want to argue with you." I said, "Great." And by the way, he was great in class. He was very smart. Very left, but sat right in the front row and, bring things up and made the class a lot better. And that's the thing I think a lot of left-leaning people on campuses don't understand is they're impoverishing their own campuses. He wasn't the only one. I had another kid take 3 classes from me, and it wasn't until the 3rd class I thought, gosh, Mr. Howard, you're a real glutton for punishment. And I get talking to him one day. I find out he's a big liberal Democrat and close personal friends with Nancy Pelosi. But he said, you're the only conservative I've ever been exposed to. It's interesting. It's challenging for me. And the style of the class is different because I think that's maybe a longer subject another day. But many conservatives teach differently than leftists do. And students understand this some. So
talk about that for a minute. That's an interesting thread.
Well, I think most conservatives, whether they're libertarians or traditionalists or Straussians or whoever, they tend to take the text more seriously. They tend to teach more from original texts rather than textbooks.
Uh-huh.
And above all, I think we are, I think I'll say this as like a collective statement, we tend to be anti-historicists, right? We take ideas seriously. We read Edmund Burke not out of antiquarian fascination, but because we think he might be right about things. He might be right today. And, your average liberal doesn't think that way. They think, ideas change with times, and they're all basically Hegelians, right? And, if you're telling students that, well, actually what Burke or Tocqueville or somebody thought doesn't really matter, is not relevant to today, then why would you take it seriously? Why would you work very hard reading it?
Yeah. So what year did you start teaching at Berkeley?
not until 2017, although I was a fellow at the fall of 2016. So I was there for the election. And you're right. They had a collective freak out on the campus when Trump won.
Yeah, I remember reading it. So you start teaching in 2017, and things go pretty well. So how did you engage with, how did cancel culture land on you?
Well, I should just back up a step. It happened at the Goldman School of Public Policy at Berkeley, which is by the U.S. News ranking the number one public policy program in the country. And it's actually, ironically, it was the dean of the school there, Henry Brady, a very distinguished political scientist, who had initially contacted me, 5-6 years ago when I was teaching at Pepperdine.
Okay.
Saying, we'd like to get some visiting conservatives come to the Goldman School. Would you be interested? And I said, maybe. And I went up and met him and met a bunch of faculty, and they really wanted me to come. And then what happened is, competition. That's a good thing. Some people who know me, I didn't know them, but who know me in the political science department got wind of this. And then John Yoo at the law school also. And they said, the Goldman School's great, but why don't you come and spend time with us in public policy in the law school? And by the way, we keep you for 2 or 3 years if you wanted. Yeah. And I thought, well, that sounds like fun. I go in for gonzo assignments. So that's what happened. But Dean Brady kept after me and said this year. And so this year I said, okay, I'll come teach for the Goldman School this year. And then what happened is that some students looked me up and had a freak out and started a Twitter storm and wrote long memos, heavily footnoted to all the woke literature about what a threat I was to them because of my racism and sexism and homophobia. And the dean, unfortunately, folded on the spot. Which I think was unfortunate. I think he actually regrets it in hindsight, because to make a long story short, the fuss didn't end with me. There were a bunch of students considering demanding that the dean resign, and one of their memos was about all of his years of macro and microaggressions and harming minorities at the Goldman School that would last for years, which, not many things deemed to last for years, but there you go.
I want to get to that in a minute. One thing you note in the article is, which I thought that was pretty funny, you had 2 course descriptions that they objected to and that caused them upset. One, you had like history of conservative thought from Burke to Bannon,
right?
As in Trump's Bannon, which I at first thought, I said to myself, well, if I was teaching that, I probably wouldn't have called it that. But it's actually kind of a smart thing to do, particularly in that environment in terms of getting students. But in any event, Bannon is something of a thinker. I'm not saying he's right, but he does have some ideas and arguments. He's read some texts closely. So it's not exactly beyond the pale that you would read him, particularly now, and they couldn't handle that.
Yeah, that was funny. That was the course title I used in the political science department. And yeah, you're right. You talk to faculty these days, especially at big universities, and they say course titles are very important. It's a marketing tool like anything else. And I taught the course once, political science, and had a pretty big class. Again, with a full spectrum of ideological views and lively discussion. And so I said, why don't I teach that class at the Goldman School? And they said, class sounds fine, but the title is way too outrageous for our very liberal students. So they suggested this very anodyne title of, I forget what it was now, but it was very bland and, background. Anyway, I taught the course. It was a much smaller class at the Goldman School and very little discussion. I had to argue with myself half the time because I couldn't get students to. And by the way, I tell students right off the bat nowadays that I'm conservative, but you're more likely to be rewarded in class if you argue with me than simply nod your head or stay silent. I want argument, and I don't ever tell students they're wrong. I believe in a dialectical, almost like a seminar process. If the student is, I think, way off and crazy, I'll say, well, you thought about this, thought about that, and then if we go on for a while and say, okay, we'll just sort of leave it there, and then we move on to other people and other things. And so anyway, I'm pretty easygoing in the classroom. But still, this class was a huge contrast to the political science classes I've had.
Yeah. In class, you quote an administrator at another school at American University saying that students seem reluctant to engage in difficult questions and debates. None of that surprises me. But did you find that to be the case in this course? And or something else, that students themselves don't trust their own reasoning. They don't actually think words and arguments can really touch anything in a true way.
I don't know how many of them have really thought it through to even 1 or 2 levels of philosophical detail, as you suggest.
Okay.
At least not at the departments I've been in. I mean, one of the reasons why this was such a shocking episode is that it's in a public policy program, which is otherwise very quantitatively oriented. Even if liberal, it's not, critical theory and some of these really insane disciplines that exist out on not on the fringes anymore, but right. That's what made it so startling.
It's interesting to think about the public policy school for a minute too. It's like, I suppose their thinking is, we're not going to interact in our own careers. We have to put up with the politics of, but we're not going to really interact with conservatives or libertarians or classical liberals or at the level of wherever they're going to end up, high bureaucratic positions in the federal government, foundation positions, whatever they're going to go out and do. This is sort of, they have the answers before them. So why are you trying to have us read primary text, Stephen? Was that sort of, I wonder if that was the public policy attitude.
Yeah, well, it could be, and here's where, having criticized Dean Brady, I should give him some praise. I mean, he's a liberal. He's not a leftist, but he's an old liberal, and he says, look, I think it is important for students to know about Edmund Burke's arguments, and so he thinks that and Hayek. He says there's great value in reading Hayek. Students should know about Hayek. Dean Brady says, I think Hayek's critique of central planning is correct. And students need to know that. And so, and by the way, he was a big fan of James Q. Wilson. Didn't agree with him about everything, but, what he really wanted from someone like me at the Goldman School was to be something like James Q. Wilson. Well, what was James Q. Wilson interested in his last decade of his life? Moral questions, questions of character, right? I don't think that would fly right now.
Marriage. He wrote a book on marriage, right?
Marriage, exactly. Right. But think about it for a minute. I think there's always been this sort of uncertainty, just to get off a little bit into the short weeds anyway. There's political science that tries to understand political life, and public policy is sort of the practical offshoot of it, I think. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people there are there to become, I guess I don't necessarily want to say technocrat the way that word's usually meant, but they're there. Maybe actually, I'll borrow from Marx. Political science students want to understand the world. Public policy students want to change it. And I really do, even though a lot of political science graduate students are pretty left, some very left, although there's also some conservatives among the political science graduate students at Berkeley. Public policy, I don't think there are any conservative graduate students. I think the number is zero. And they're there to want to change the world. And I think you're right. I think when you're in the big bubble of a university, you don't think, the general public narrative is that Republicans have only won elections by cheating, by deceiving people, et cetera, et cetera. They don't take the argument seriously.
Well, it's also, and this is not an original observation, but number one public policy school in America, which aspires to be, I assume, not merely a national school, but an international school, and the positions its graduates aspire to, and yet you're the only conservative faculty member. Maybe there's some moderate progressives, but you're the only one, and the students almost uniformly left. That to me, that's just sort of just indicative of just an intellectual failure going on, and if and when that's the case, it's not merely what text aren't you reading? It's what questions do you not even know to ask, which leads to, this is in the article, you're denounced by student groups called Equity and Public Policy, who form a consortium to attack you. Students of color in public policy and black students in public policy. And they said that Stephen Hayward was, quote, a climate denier who actively promotes ideas that harm communities of color and other marginalized groups, and for your, quote, repeated racist, misogynistic, and transphobic statements. Stephen Hayward, how do you plead to those?
Well, I got a whole bunch of new readers for my posts on the Powerline blog, which can be pretty which can be pretty polemical. But of course, what am I usually doing? I'm usually citing Thomas Sowell, John McWhorter, Coleman Hughes, right? And I haven't actually, I think maybe I've written only two things ever about same-sex marriage, and usually it was sort of analytical things, right? I remember writing an article once about my conversations with Jonathan Rauch about same-sex marriage, and I've written a couple of things about, what I guess we call transgenderism, actually a form of ideology. It sure seems like it, but I've written a couple of things about, the identity question, and in a very skeptical vein, but not hostile, because I talked about transgender people I know and what they say, and say, here are things to think about. But the point is, if you're not, it's a very narrow orthodoxy. I think this is what we all know. Yeah. And it was just a shock to read it. And the climate thing's completely wrong, but of course that is true for a long time, that you're either a true believer or you're the moral equivalent of a Holocaust denier, right? You're not allowed to be a lukewarmer, of which there's a lot of people who fit in that category, like Matt Ridley, for example, and lots of others, and including, by the way, some Berkeley faculty in the physics department.
Yeah.
But that's where we are. All these talks of tolerance turn out to be pretty particular and narrow.
No, it was also, I mean, I chuckled at this. You also had this very negative response from a course you taught, and I think this actually ties into what you just said about public policy students. You're going to teach a course on sort of approaches to environmentalism outside of the mainstream. And so you were going to teach, I think part of the course description was free market environmentalism, and you were going to teach the book, which I've read and actually used in conferences, called Free Market Environmentalism by Terry Anderson and was it Donald Leal, which is largely seen as the book that sort of launched free market environmentalism. I think it came out in the early 1980s. And this was triggering and hateful and unsettling. And I thought, oh my gosh, we can't even have a conversation about that in a public policy school.
Yeah, that was really amazing. And I should fill in a little bit. Unless somebody knows this field, they won't necessarily get it from the description. I printed in full in commentary. So it's going to be free market environmentalism, eco-modernism, degrowth, and I forget that other heterodox. So I was going to do degrowth is sort of the revival of Malthusianism, and they've got a couple of prominent faculty at Berkeley who are behind it. Plus, I have a couple of people I know who are sort of on the fringes of that. I was going to invite them to class as guest speakers. To represent the point of view and disagree with me. But then one of the other key books I was going to use was Elinor Ostrom's Managing the Commons, which, Elinor Ostrom was until last fall one of the only woman to have won the Nobel Prize in economics. And near as I can tell, she's totally unknown by anybody at the Goldman School. And, her work is sort of in a netherworld in between old command and control regulation and pure markets and property rights. And as such, you get a whole, eco-modernism are the sort of the aggressive environmentalists who have broken with the old Malthusianism and want to talk about the importance of economic growth and technology as solutions to environmental problems. So it's going to give a whole spectrum of things. And I know some of the eco-modernists in the Bay Area and going to have them in the talk. And I wasn't even going to talk about climate because I think climate change is sort of wrecking the environmental movement. It's just swallowing the whole thing alive. And I thought this would be something different, but it didn't matter. Just the fact that I had dissented from the party line in the past meant I was wholly unacceptable. And I think just using the phrase free market environmentalism is like waving a red flag for a bull. Everybody freaked out. Because the fall, my course in the fall was totally went off without a hitch, no fuss. It was, as I say, a bit of a disappointment in the classroom dynamic, but it wasn't until my spring graduate seminar was announced, and it was listed within 72 hours, all hell broke loose.
It's interesting. I mean, going back to something you said, the free market environmentalism requires a bit of policy work. It requires a pretty deep understanding of economic concepts, and then sort of applying that to problems in environmental policy use and how various companies engage with the environment, and sort of getting them to engage with it in a pro-environmental way, but using market ideas to do so, not regulation. And now maybe they weren't even at that level in their objection to you, but it's sort of like a recognition that this doesn't involve us as much. This would not be for the public policy students to engage in. Really, it's pro-business or something like that. I wondered if maybe that was their thinking, but that may have been too deep.
No, well, I think you're probably right about that. I know Larry Alexander at University of San Diego Law School used to teach a course on the environment from a contrarian point of view, and he said it was known among the law students as the polluter's perspective. Yeah. And of course, if you know the free market environmental literature, especially the thread of it that talks about common law remedies, and it often comes as a surprise to environmentalists when I explain to them that in fact the regulatory state that they like so much actually has foreclosed a bunch of common law remedies that ordinary people can use, against corporations, against the government. Interestingly, the people who understand this clearly are some old Marxist historians like Oh, I'm thinking of the guy who wrote The Transformation of American Law at Harvard years ago, who I'm blanking on his name right now, or, Gabriel Kolko's famous Triumph of Conservatism. And, for public policy students who otherwise are pretty quantitative, I mean, the Goldman School and most other elite programs require a lot of quantitative analysis classes and statistics. You would think that it would fit in well, how would the structure markets and incentives and tradable permits and so on and so forth work out as a superior remedy for, let's have another rulemaking from the EPA. But there's no imagination for that at all right now. And obviously, as we see, not much openness even to considering the question.
Yeah, that would be my understanding. Think about the public policy school dean who had invited you to come teach and wanted your perspective. So when he gets attacked, he sort of folds like a cheap suit. He says, I'll just read it to you. It's in the article. I owe an apology to all of you. I take full responsibility, as it was my sole decision to invite Stephen Hayward to the Goldman School of Public Policy to teach 2 courses, one in the fall and the spring. I took the fact that he was already affiliated with IGS, Institute for Governmental Studies, and teaching at Berkeley Law as indicators that he would be a thoughtful person. But that is not the case. I was not aware of his statements that belittle others and undermine our shared goals of ensuring a just and inclusive society. It's one thing to disagree with someone. It's another to demean them. So he, in a way, he realized he was on the wrong side of the mob and sought to join them, not unlike, say, Mayor Ted Wheeler.
Yeah. By the way, I met Ted Wheeler once a few years ago before he was mayor.
He looks like a perfectly nice man.
And he has like an MBA from Stanford or Yale, I forget where, and he was treasurer of the state of Oregon. Yeah, I thought in the ordinary sense he seemed quite able, and well, anyway, now he's just awful. So if he hadn't been mayor, he would have become a dean, it seems.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's getting us off track. Yeah, I don't know if the dean actually read any of this statements that the students were talking about, I think, or if he did, but because look, I've known him for a while. He'd come to some events that I'd done. I did a conference a couple of years ago. I organized through IGS on intellectual diversity. I had Harvey Mansfield out from Harvard as the keynote speaker, and Josh Dunn from Colorado, Steve Tellis from Johns Hopkins, and Dean Brady came to several of the sessions, and then I've run into other places and talked to a bunch. So, look, the guy knows me. It wasn't like he plucked me out of the phone book and was suddenly surprised. He said he was totally aware of, when we first talked 5 years ago, he was totally aware of my climate work in places like the Weekly Standard and the Public Interest and elsewhere. So, by the way, he put that statement out to everybody, the faculty and all the students, before he talked to me, without contacting me first, for me to say, really? I mean,
wow.
And so I think it's one thing he's embarrassed about. But as I say, the students were after him. And by the way, the students backed off demanding his resignation, instead saying, we need to start planning your succession right away. I think the idea is they want a much more radical dean than him. I think there's some chance that will happen. Dean Brady's been very successful in the usual role of raising money and raising the profile of the school. He's been really very good that way. So we'll see about that. And that's why, if I could mention it, that's why I wrote the second half of the article about Aaron Wildavsky, the great political scientist at Berkeley. He founded the Goldman School back in the early 70s. And I just quoted a few things he'd said. I could have gone on a long time about Aaron, who I knew a little bit before he died. They couldn't hire him today because my views are about the same as his views on identity politics, on environment, and so forth.
One thing I did want to say, it seems to me we were talking about the administrators earlier in the interview, and how the administrators goad the students on. Well, it's like the feedback loop. The students have now realized the way to get change on campus or to get their way is to make hurl these accusations. So it's not that Brady is an evil guy, but he's been open to evil things. He's allowed them to happen. He hasn't been nearly as aggressive as he needs to be. And this now means we need a change or something like that. I mean, it's this sort of inability to have any sort of conversation or debate on campus. And the fact that, that is damning, that he would turn you out before even talking to you as an equal, as an academic equal. That's shocking. I mean, it sort of, undermines the entire idea of an academic enterprise.
Yeah, and it's spreading rapidly. As we're talking, I just read a story yesterday or the day before about Tulane University.
Yeah,
where
I saw that.
Some group was, right, you see the story. Well, for listeners who don't, I forget whether it's a class or student group or whatever. They were going to host an author who'd written a self-critical book about the legacy of his grandparents or great-grandparents in the Klan. In other words, it's an anti-racist book, very much in the vein of, not revisionist history, but, highlighting some really ugly aspects of American history. And students complained that this was hurtful. They don't even get, and so they canceled the event. And, where are the adults in the room to say, you people are complaining about this, you need to grow up. That's what needs to happen. And there's nobody doing that any place.
It is. It's a complete evacuation of any moral authority, it seems to me, or confidence in or what we are actually here to do in the academy, which isn't to carry on just political conversations. And if we do have them, we have them in a different way. What I took from your Aaron Wildavsky discussion, which I thought was really well stated, Wildavsky was a traditional liberal, a New Deal liberal, confidence in government, confidence in the administrative state to achieve good outcomes, but becomes skeptical over time about some of those aims and some of the loftier objectives being voiced. And also within academia would have been a conservative because he did believe in the idea, debate, dialectic process itself. And so he wouldn't have understood this. And also, as you quote him, incredibly skeptical of climate change, global warming in the early 90s.
Yeah, that's right. And I don't think he would have changed his mind if he'd lived on. I mean, he died in 1993, I think, and of lung cancer, unfortunately. He'd been a lifelong smoker, but I don't think he would have changed his mind at all because he wrote a lot about environmental issues, not just climate, but risk assessment of all kinds is one of his great strengths. And it's and I will say, just in passing, the political science department at Berkeley, it's very large. It's also very highly ranked, but it actually has a few conservatives lurking around. They're not outspoken like, say, Mansfield or somebody. And they have a lot of sort of old sensible liberals teaching there. And so there's actually more diversity in the right sense of the word of thought there than we now see at the Goldman School, which I think is a pretty stark thing.
Very stark. So overall, you're going to teach in the law school, I think you told me.
Yeah, no, that's another, I've taught a class because I'm going to teach again this next spring with Judge Janice Rogers Brown.
Oh, wow.
Also a fellow at the law school. Well, and we teach a class on natural law jurisprudence. And it's just a small seminar, but we get some liberal students in there. And again, it's the same experience. We actually read some Cicero, we read some Aristotle, and most of the students really have never read any of these old texts at all and are completely unfamiliar with them. And they like it. It's the most highly ranked course I've taught at Berkeley in the student evaluation.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Yeah, I remember John Yu, who also teaches at Berkeley, he told me one time in his course on constitutional law, when he gets to the 14th Amendment, they read about Reconstruction and the period of Reconstruction. And none of the students, he told me, have very little knowledge of what that is. At the same time, they're very sure what the 14th Amendment means. It's interesting to me right away about what students actually know, don't know, and what they're claiming is absolutely true.
Right. I remember Robert Bork, who I knew a bit, when we overlapped at AEI years ago, he used to talk about how, this turns out to be literally true, most constitutional law curriculum at law schools, and maybe it was where you went, it begins with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And that's kind of the whole Constitution now. And the historical context of it is not taught at all. You just go straight to the case law. I found, to my surprise, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but a couple times in various classes, I bring up the question of social justice, and I've included Hayek's famous essay on the mirage of social justice a couple of times. But then I also talk about, how does this compare to some of the old classical categories of social justice, like you find in Aristotle, commutative justice, distributive justice. And what I realized from the looks on students' faces, and also they come up to me after the classes, they've never heard of those before.
Yeah.
So the whole lineage of that is just not in their education anyplace. And so then I end up teaching Aristotle too. So I joke a lot that, and this is what John's point is, an awful lot of what conservatives do in higher education is remedial education, willy-nilly, right? I end up telling people what Plato's Republic is about, or certain parts of it, right? Because it's not read anymore. And I sneak in Tocqueville. And so I think that's, again, why conservatives teach differently is it's not uniform, but a lot of us are actually teaching Western civilization in a clandestine way because it's not taught. And even liberal students kind of want to know it.
Yes. No, I think that's right. It's funny. I've only, in the summertime I teach, various conservative organization students, and of course these students are remarkably open to that and prefer that, and many of them attend institutions or take classes where that's the case. But yeah, I haven't had sort of the general experience of what you're describing. Stephen Hayward, so you go on. You've not been canceled. You obviously have a lot of places to write and publish, and you'll still be at the law school. So we look forward to continue to hear from you.
Well, thanks, Richard. This has been fun as always.
All right. Hey, thank you so much. This is Richard Reinsch. You've been listening to another episode of Liberty Law Talk, available at lawliberty.org.